Long before the world spoke of America, this vast land already breathed with its own life. Forests stretched endlessly, whispering to the wind in a thousand voices. Great rivers curved like silver veins through untouched wilderness, and snow-capped mountains rose in silence toward the clouds. Here, for countless generations, countless nations have lived. The people of these lands did not see themselves as owners, but as keepers. They hunted with respect, farmed with rhythm, and told stories by the fire about spirits that walked beside them. From the icy north to the golden deserts, hundreds of languages carried songs of belonging. To the east, the Iroquois built longhouses and leagues of unity. In the Great Plains, the Sioux followed the buffalo and the rhythm of the earth. Farther west, the Pueblos shaped cities of clay and sun, while the Navajo wove meaning into every pattern of cloth. Each people had their own time, their own way of life, yet all shared a bond with the living world. And then, across the endless sea, sails began to rise. At first, they were whispers on the horizon, strangers in wooden ships, crossing waters no human had ever dared to cross before. The Norse may have touched the northern shores centuries earlier, leaving traces of rumor and legend. But it was not until the 15th and 16th centuries that the Great Wave came. Explorers, driven by maps unfinished, by gold and by faith. The Spanish were among the first to arrive, their ships anchored on coasts that would one day be called Florida, Texas, and California. They planted crosses, built missions, and searched the sands for silver and souls. To the north, the French sailed down the wide St. Lawrence River, trading furs and building friendships and rivalries with the peoples of the Great Lakes. And to the east, the English began their quiet, cautious settlements. Jamestown in 1607, Plymouth in 1620. Names that would echo for centuries, born from hunger, courage, and hope. The journey was not kind to them. In the beginning, the colonies were fragile, clusters of wooden houses clinging to the edge of an unknown world. Famine, disease, and cold took more lives than war ever could, and yet they endured. More ships came, carrying families, farmers, preachers, and dreamers. Each carried something invisible, a vision of a better world, though few could agree on what better meant. To the south, plantations began to rise, vast fields of tobacco and rice worked by enslaved Africans, taken from their own homelands and sold across oceans. Their labor built fortunes, but their suffering built shadows that would never fade. In the north, small towns and wooden churches grew among forests and rivers, shaped by trade and the stubborn faith of Puritans and Quakers. And between them stretched an untamed world, wilderness that seemed eternal, yet changed with every axe and plow. The colonies slowly began to take root. 13 of them lined the coast like stepping stones, each with its own laws, accents, and ambitions. They were loyal to the British crown, but their hearts were beginning to drift. Across the Atlantic, Across the Atlantic, a king ruled from a distance so vast it might as well have been another planet. His taxes were heavy, his understanding light, and the colonists, children of England, now grown into something else, began to murmur among themselves. By the early 1700s, the New World was no longer new. It was alive with contradiction, faith and greed, freedom and cruelty, courage and conquest. The frontier pushed farther west, and the forests grew smaller. The indigenous peoples watched their lands shrink and their nations fracture, yet their spirit endured. They became traders, guides, warriors, and sometimes allies, navigating between worlds as best they could. History would remember them in fragments, but their presence never vanished. It still lingers in the names of rivers, mountains, and towns whispered across the map. By mid-century, the colonies had become something England had not expected: prosperous, restless, and proud. Merchants in Boston and Philadelphia grew rich. Planters in Virginia built mansions from the profits of human bondage, and the children of these settlers, born on this soil, not across the sea, began to feel less English and more something new. They had never walked the streets of London, never bowed before its palaces. Their loyalty, like their identity, was beginning to shift. But independence was still a dream, faint and fragile. For now the colonies were still tied to the empire, their goods, their laws, and their wars. England fought France in battles that stretched across continents, from Canada to the Caribbean. The colonists fought beside them, died beside them, and then, when the war was done, were told to pay the bill. New taxes arrived like waves against the shore: the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the townshend duties. To the king it was business. To the colonies it was betrayal. Protests grew. Pamphlets shouted rebellion. And in a harbor called Boston, one night, they threw the king's tea into the dark water. The echo of that splash would reach London, and then the world. No one knew it yet, but history had already begun to turn. The age of discovery was ending. The age of revolution was about to begin. The year was 1763, and peace had returned to the colonies, at least for a moment. Britain had triumphed over France, but victory came with a price. The empire was in debt, and across the sea, ministers began to look toward America to pay it. At first, the changes seemed small: new taxes on paper, paint, sugar, and tea. But for a people who had built their own towns, raised their own militias, and governed their own lives, it felt like a chain being slipped quietly over their wrists. They had fought beside British soldiers, buried their dead under the same flag, and now they were treated as subjects, not partners. Across taverns and meeting halls, voices began to rise. Pamphlets appeared like sparks. No taxation without representation. Ordinary farmers and shopkeepers began to speak the language of philosophers. Freedom, that word whispered across centuries, took on a new, electric meaning. In Boston, the tension thickened. British soldiers filled the streets, red coats glinting beneath grey skies. Crowds gathered, tempers burned. Snowballs became stones. Then, on a cold March evening in 1770, gunfire shattered the night. 5 colonists lay dead. The Boston Massacre, they called it, and the blood that stained the cobblestones would never wash away from memory. Yet rebellion still moved slowly. For many, loyalty ran deep. The king's image still hung in taverns and churches. But the seed was planted, and 5 years later, in 1775, it broke through the soil. The spark came again in Boston. Ships in the harbor, crates of tea, men in disguise. Under moonlight, they boarded the vessels, split open the cargo, and poured the empire's wealth into the sea. The water turned black with protest, and the world took notice. Britain answered with anger. The port was closed, troops poured in, but punishment only united them. 13 distant outposts began to see themselves as one. From Virginia to Massachusetts, delegates rode for Philadelphia to talk, to argue, to dream. The First Continental Congress met in 1774. No one yet dared to speak openly of independence, but the thought hung in the air like the smell of gunpowder before a battle. They wrote letters to the king, petitions to Parliament, and when no reply came, they prepared. Then came April 1775, Lexington, Concord. At dawn, the first shot was fired. a single crack that echoed across the colonies. No one knew who pulled the trigger, but it didn't matter. The world had changed. Farmers with muskets faced trained soldiers, and even though they broke and ran, the message was clear. The fight had begun. George Washington, tall, solemn, and silent, was chosen to command the Continental Army. He rode north through summer fields to take control of men who had never fought in uniform, who carried hunting rifles and faith in equal measure. Against him stood the might of Britain, its fleet, its discipline, its empire. For months the war hovered between disaster and miracle. Cities burned, armies starved, and then in a quiet hall in Philadelphia, words were written that would outlast every musket and cannon. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. It was July the 4th, 1776. They signed their names, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and many more, knowing it could mean death. Each signature was an act of rebellion and faith. Outside, bells rang through the heat of summer. A nation had been declared, not yet born, but declared. Across the colonies, people gathered to read the words aloud. In taverns, in courtyards, by candlelight, they whispered the lines again and again, as if repeating them could make them real. But reality came with a cost. The British struck back with fury. Armies landed in New York, burning towns and scattering rebels. Washington lost battle after battle, retreating across the frozen Delaware. By winter, the revolution seemed over, a dream trampled in the snow. Yet it was in that winter that America learned endurance. At Valley Forge, men wrapped their feet in rags and trained beneath the gray sky. Hunger gnawed at them, but belief kept them standing. When spring returned, they marched again. Not for pay, not for empire, but for the fragile idea of freedom. Across the ocean, the French king watched with interest and envy. Old rivals of Britain, the French saw an opportunity in the colonies' courage. In 1778, their ships sailed west to join the fight. With their help, the tide began to turn. By 1781, at Yorktown, the British found themselves surrounded. The French fleet at sea, Washington's army on land. Cannon thundered for days until the redcoats laid down their arms. The war was over. In the autumn light, the American soldiers stood silent as their enemies marched past. There was no cheering, no taunting, only exhaustion and disbelief. After 7 long years, they had done the impossible. But independence is only the beginning of freedom. The old world had fallen away. The new world stood uncertain on trembling legs. 13 colonies had won their right to exist, but had yet to learn how to live together. Their government was weak, their debts heavy, and their unity fragile. Still, hope lingered. As Washington rode home through fields of corn and quiet towns, people lined the roads to see him pass. They called him hero, savior, father of the nation, but he said little. He knew that victory was not the end of the story, it was the start of a harder one. And so, as the sun set over the United States, the people looked westward, toward a frontier stretching beyond imagination, and a future waiting to be written. The war was over. The gun had fallen silent, and the world looked toward a new experiment, a nation born not of kings or conquerors, but of words. In the soft light of 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the United States of America, and across the ocean bells rang for peace. On parchment, lines were drawn to mark the new borders. Yet in truth, the country was still an idea, fragile as a candle flame. The men who had fought together now faced a question far greater than war. How does one build a republic from dust and dreams? The first attempt was called the Articles of Confederation, a loose union of states, each guarding its own power. It was government by trust alone, and soon it began to crack. Debts piled up, states argued, armies went unpaid, and the very freedom they had bled for seemed to crumble from within. In Philadelphia, the founders met again. The summer of 1787 was sweltering, the air thick with flies and debate. Behind closed doors, 55 men argued over the shape of the future. Some feared too much power, others feared too little. And slowly, through compromise and exhaustion, they built a system that balanced both, a constitution. It began with words that echoed like prayer: "We, the people of the United States." They created three branches: legislative, executive, judicial, each watching the other, like stars bound in orbit. It was a document born of fear and faith, designed to last beyond them all. When it was finally signed, Benjamin Franklin, old and frail, was asked what kind of government they had given the people. He smiled faintly and said, "A republic, if you can keep it." George Washington became the first president, though he had never wanted the crown of power. He took the oath on a spring morning in 1789, his hands trembling slightly on the Bible. The city was still small, muddy streets, wooden houses, but the moment was vast. Every gesture, every word was being written into history. He set precedents with quiet restraint. He refused to be called Your Excellency. He stepped down after 2 terms, proving that the presidency was service, not possession. When he retired to Mount Vernon, he left behind something greater than victory: an example of dignity in power and humility in leadership. The new republic faced storms from the beginning. In Europe, old empires clashed again. Britain and France at war, and America, young and untested, stood caught between them. Ships were seized, sailors taken, trade threatened. Within its borders, political factions grew, the Federalists and Republicans, each accusing the other of betraying the revolution's spirit. Yet the nation endured. It expanded westward, beyond the Appalachian Mountains, into lands of forests and plains known only to the peoples who had lived there for millennia. The Lewis and Clark expedition followed rivers that seemed to flow forever, mapping the bones of a continent. Pioneers followed behind them, carrying wagons, faith, and hunger for land. But every mile west brought conflict. The frontier was not empty, it was alive. Nations like the Cherokee, Creek, and Shawnee resisted as their worlds vanished before their eyes. Treaties were signed and broken, promises made and forgotten. The dream of expansion was built on a deep sorrow the new nation chose not to see. As the century turned, America began to change. Factories rose along rivers. Cities grew louder, faster, brighter. The age of steam and iron had arrived. The country's heart beat with invention. Cotton gins, printing presses, railroads, tools that would reshape everything. But even as the nation grew stronger, a shadow lengthened across it: slavery. In the South, the cotton fields stretched like oceans, worked by millions of enslaved men, women, and children. Their songs carried through the night, filled with pain and hope, the secret language of survival. In the North, abolitionists began to speak louder, writing, preaching, pleading for justice. 2 worlds existed within one flag, and each year the tension grew. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory from France, a deal so vast it doubled the size of the nation overnight. He called it a noble bargain. Others called it destiny. But for people who already lived on that land, it was displacement without end. As the young republic stretched across rivers and mountains, It began to define itself not just by geography, but by belief. Freedom, opportunity, progress, words repeated like scripture, even when their meaning was unevenly applied. The War of 1812 tested that belief again. British troops burned Washington, the capital itself left in smoke and ash. And yet, out of that fire came resilience, a nation anthem born beside a tattered flag still standing in the dawn. When peace returned, a new pride took root. Americans began to call their country not just a place, but a promise. By the 1820s, writers, artists, and statesmen spoke of a destiny, manifest, divine, unstoppable, that the nation was meant to reach from ocean to ocean. But destiny, as history always reminds us, demands a price. Westward expansion brought progress for some, ruin for others. The Trail of Tears carried thousands of native families from their homelands, walking through snow and death toward lands they did not know. The same Congress that spoke of liberty also approved their removal. And in every generation, the contradiction grew louder. How could a nation built on freedom survive while so many remained unfree? The answer was coming, though few yet knew it. In the fields, in the factories, in the halls of Congress, a storm was gathering. The lines were being drawn, not on maps but in hearts, and soon the dream of unity would be tested in fire once more. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States was no longer an experiment. It was a force, restless, expanding, hungry. From the Atlantic to the Mississippi, towns rose where forests once stood. Railroads carved across plains, steamships crowded rivers that had once known only silence and wind. The air was thick with ambition. Inventions and fortunes multiplied. Cities glowed with gaslight. Newspapers spread ideas faster than ever before. It was an age of movement, of dreamers, settlers, and wanderers, all chasing something they could not name. To many, this growth felt like destiny fulfilled. But beneath the celebration, old fractures deepened. The South lived by the rhythm of the plantation, by cotton, by labor, by chains. Its wealth rested on the backs of millions who had no freedom. In the North, factories and mills spun a new kind of prosperity, one that required machines instead of slaves. Each side believed its way was progress, and neither could imagine the other's survival. The 1820s and 1830s brought compromise after compromise, each one a patch on a widening tear. The Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state. Congress hesitated. The Missouri Compromise drew an invisible line across the map. Above it, no slavery. Below it, the old order remained. But lines on paper could not contain conviction. Every new territory stirred the same question. Would it be slave or free? Each answer pleased one half of the nation and enraged the other. While politicians argued, people began to act. In the South, slaveholders tightened their grip, fearing rebellion. In the North, abolitionists raised their voices, their pens, their prayers. Names like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman became whispers of courage and defiance. Through hidden paths known as the Underground Railroad, the enslaved fled north beneath the stars, guided by faith, risk, and the promise of freedom. Each escape was a victory, and each victory a wound to those who profited from bondage. The debate over slavery was no longer political. It was moral, spiritual, unstoppable. As the frontier pushed west, new storms gathered. Settlers crossed the Mississippi and kept going. Through Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, and beyond. The land seemed endless, but conflict followed them everywhere. Mexico, newly independent, watched nervously as the United States crept closer. Then came Texas. Settled by Americans, it rebelled against Mexico and declared itself free. Soon after, it sought to join the Union, and the question returned, slave or free? The war that followed, the Mexican-American War, added vast new lands to the American map. California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada. It was a triumph for expansion, but a tragedy for peace. Each new territory reopened the wound. And in the gold-rich hills of California, the discovery of fortune only deepened the hunger for more. The nation was young and growing, but like a tree that expands too fast, its roots were straining against the earth. In 1850, a new compromise tried once again to save the Union. California entered as free, but the Fugitive Slave Act forced all states, even the free ones, to return escaped slaves to their masters. The law reached into every town and every conscience. Now, the North could no longer ignore the South's chains. The nation's moral fault line ran through its very soul. That same decade, the debate turned violent. In Kansas, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought in the streets, a preview of the war to come. Bleeding Kansas, they called it. Houses burned, men died, and in the Senate itself, a congressman was beaten nearly to death for speaking against slavery. The age of reason was ending. Emotion had taken its place. Through it all, one figure began to rise. A tall, solemn lawyer from Illinois with a face carved by thought and sorrow. Abraham Lincoln spoke softly but carried words like thunder. He did not begin as an abolitionist, but as a believer in unity. Yet, as he read the words of the Constitution, as he saw the suffering of the enslaved, he began to realize what the founders had left unfinished. In his debates with Stephen Douglas, Lincoln spoke of a nation divided. A house divided against itself cannot stand. The words echoed across the land. Calm, deliberate, undeniable. He did not threaten war, he warned of it. By 1860, the country stood at the edge of an abyss. Each side feared the other's victory more than its own defeat. When Lincoln was elected president, the South saw not a man but a verdict. Within weeks, states began to secede. One by one, like stars falling from the flag. They formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America, built on the belief that freedom could exist beside slavery. And in the cold of April 1861, the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. The cannon thundered across Charleston Harbor. Smoke rose above the water, and just like that, peace was gone. Families were torn apart, friends became enemies. The North called it a rebellion. The South called it defense. Each side claimed God and destiny, and the fields that had once grown cotton and corn would soon be fields of graves. The Union, as Washington had once feared, was breaking. But the story of America, that strange and stubborn story of freedom, was not finished. From the ashes of the old dream, a new one would rise, tested in blood and remembered for generations. Brother faced brother, and the promise of the new world trembled. The cannons at Fort Sumter marked the end of one world and the birth of another. Smoke drifted over Charleston Harbor as the Union flag fell, and in that grey dawn, both sides believed the war would be brief.
A single campaign, perhaps a season, but history had other plans. The young men who marched to war carried drums, banners, and confidence. They sang songs of glory, waving to crowds that lined the streets. No one yet understood what was coming. No one imagined that the rivers themselves would run red. In the north, President Lincoln moved quietly through sleepless nights, weighed down by the burden of holding a nation together. He spoke softly of union, never vengeance. "We are not enemies," he said, "but friends. We must not be enemies." But friendship was gone. The time for words had passed. The first great battle came at a place called Bull Run. Spectators brought picnic baskets to watch, as if war were theater. When the smoke cleared, horror replaced wonder. Bodies lay across the fields, and both sides realized the truth. This would not be a skirmish of months, but a trial of years. Factories in the north turned to war. Iron, gunpowder, locomotives. The South, rich in courage but poor in industry, relied on faith and the sharpness of its generals. From Virginia's green hills to Tennessee's rivers, battles flared and faded like lightning. The Battle of Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg, names that would be carved into stone and memory. At Antietam, 23,000 men fell in a single day. For every mile gained, another was lost. Every victory was soaked in mourning. While soldiers fought, the enslaved waited, listening. They heard rumors of freedom moving like a wind through the camps. In 1863, Lincoln took pen to paper and changed the meaning of the war forever. The Emancipation Proclamation declared that all enslaved people in the rebelling states were free. The words did not free everyone overnight, but they turned the tide of purpose. The war for union had become a war for human dignity. And in that moment, America began to remake itself. Black soldiers joined the fight under their own banner, the United States colored troops, marching not just for a country, but for a future that had once seemed impossible. Their courage at Fort Wagner at Petersburg, at every front, became proof that freedom was no gift, it was earned. But freedom, like victory, demanded sacrifice. The South fought on with desperate fury. Its towns crumbled, its fields burned, yet its pride held firm. Robert E. Lee, calm and solemn, led armies that seemed to rise from the ashes again and again. Opposite him, Ulysses S. Grant advanced without pause, relentless, patient, unshakable. By 1864, the war had become a storm that consumed everything. Cities were emptied, families scattered, the land scarred. In Georgia, General Sherman's army marched to the sea, burning a path through the Confederacy. Behind them, the smoke of Atlanta rose against the crimson sky, a symbol of endings and of something yet to be reborn. Lincoln watched, weary, older than his years. He walked the corridors of the White House in silence, listening to the rain against the windows, knowing that each drop might mark another lost life. He carried the weight of every telegram, every name, and still he wrote, "With malice toward none, with charity for all." Words meant for the day peace would finally return. That day came in the spring of 1865. At Appomattox Courthouse, Lee met Grant. The two men spoke quietly, without triumph or humiliation. When they shook hands, the war ended not with cheers but with relief. The Union was saved, but changed forever. More than 600,000 lives had been lost. Towns lay in ruins, families torn beyond repair. The dream of America had survived, but its innocence had died. In the months that followed, hope flickered again. Freedmen walked the roads toward uncertain futures, carrying nothing but belief. The flag flew once more above a united nation. and for a moment it seemed the dawn had finally come. Then, one April night, inside a crowded theater in Washington, D.C., a gunshot shattered that fragile peace. President Lincoln fell, and with him the light of reconciliation dimmed. The nation stood in mourning, not only for a man, but for the spirit of gentleness he carried through the storm. Outside the Capitol, the cherry blossoms fell like snow, and the country wondered if it could ever heal. But history does not end with sorrow. Out of ashes, new generations would rise, builders, dreamers, and seekers, shaping the next chapter of the American story. The war had broken the old world, yet it also cleared the path for something greater to emerge. The United States would rebuild, redefine, and rise again. Stronger, more divided, more alive than ever before. And so, as the smoke of war faded across the horizon, a fragile silence settled over the land. The war had ended, but peace did not come easily. The battlefields were quiet now, no drums, no smoke, only silence and ruin. Cities lay in ashes, farms empty, bridges shattered. A nation that had torn itself apart now faced a harder task, to stitch itself back together. In the spring of 1865, the South was unrecognizable. Fields once white with cotton were grey with neglect. Railways were broken, towns hollowed by fire. Every family had lost someone. The victors were weary, and the defeated were bitter. Freedom had come, but it arrived on unsteady legs. 4 million people, once enslaved, stepped into the light of their first uncertain dawn of liberty. They carried no property, no savings, often no names that were truly their own. Yet they walked forward, building homes from wood and hope, forming communities, schools, and churches across the wreckage of the old order. Their joy was tempered by danger, their freedom tested every day by those who refused to accept it. The federal government sent soldiers and teachers into the South to protect and rebuild. For a few years, Reconstruction brought a fragile sense of possibility. New laws declared the rights of citizenship, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, promising freedom, equality, and the vote. Black men were elected to Congress, families reunited after years of separation, children learned to read under candlelight for the first time. It was a moment when the dream of America seemed to expand, stretching to include those it had long ignored. But dreams invite resistance. Former Confederates called it humiliation. Secret groups rose in the night, hoods, torches, and fear. The Ku Klux Klan spread terror across the South, burning schools, lynching men who dared to vote, women who dared to teach. The promise of freedom was met by the shadow of hate. By 1877, Reconstruction was over. Federal troops withdrew, and the South was left to govern itself. In their place came new laws, new chains. Jim Crow, referring to the system of racial apartheid and segregation laws, separating black from white in every street, every school, every future. Freedom had not vanished, but it had been cornered. While the South struggled with its ghosts, the rest of the nation surged forward. The industrial age had arrived like thunder. Steel, coal, and steam reshaped everything. In the north, smokestacks rose higher than church towers. Railroads linked oceans, cities, and markets in iron threads. Where once the land had stretched endless and wild, now the whistle of trains filled the wind. Immigrants arrived by the millions, from Ireland, Germany, Italy, China. They came with empty pockets and full hearts, chasing the same fragile hope, that hard work could rewrite destiny. They built railways across mountains, carved tunnels through rock, and raised cities of steel and brick. Their names would rarely appear in history books, but their hands built the modern world. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. East met west in a single line of polished iron. At Promontory Summit, two locomotives faced each other nose to nose, and a golden spike was driven into the rail, the symbolic joining of a continent. It was more than a triumph of engineering. It was the binding of a fractured nation. But the price of progress was high. The West was not empty, though many claimed it was. It was filled with life, nations of the plains, herds of buffalo, languages that carried centuries of wisdom. As settlers moved west, those worlds were pushed aside. The Indian Wars raged through the 1870s, scattering tribes into reservations. At Wounded Knee, in the cold of 1890, hundreds were slaughtered. It was the final act of conquest, and a silence fell across the plains where songs had once echoed. Still, the story of America rolled forward. New inventions transformed daily life. The telegraph, the telephone, the electric light. The Gilded Age began. An age of wealth and contradiction. Magnates like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt built empires of industry. Their fortunes glittered like the skyline itself, while millions labored for pennies in crowded tenements. In New York, the Statue of Liberty was raised in 1886, a gift from France, shining above the harbor. For immigrants arriving by ship, it was the first thing they saw, a woman of bronze holding a torch against the night. She stood for welcome, but also for challenge. The poem at her base spoke of the tired, poor, and huddled masses. And yet many who came found not paradise but survival. By the end of the century, the United States had changed beyond recognition. It was no longer a scattered collection of states, but a continental power. Its railroads stretched over deserts, its factories lit up the night. Cities hummed with electricity and ambition. But under the noise, the question remained: what kind of nation would this be? For all its progress, the same contradictions lingered. Freedom and prejudice walked side by side. Wealth and poverty shared the same streets. Inventions promised equality. Yet power gathered in the hands of the few. The Civil War had ended slavery, but not struggle. The century closed with the same uneasy balance it had begun with: hope against injustice, promise against pain. And in that balance, America prepared to step into a new century, one of machines, skyscrapers, and voices demanding to be heard. The new century arrived with a sound the world had never heard before: the hum of machines, the whistle of trains, the low electric buzz of cities that never slept. America entered the 1900s with confidence, invention, and a quiet belief that anything was possible. Skyscrapers began to climb into the clouds, their steel skeletons rising higher each month. Elevators, electric lights, and telephones turned fantasy into routine. The horse gave way to the automobile, and soon the streets were alive with engines, horns, and the smell of oil and dust. Factories poured smoke into the sky. Typewriters clicked in endless rhythm. It was an age of speed. An age that believed in itself. Millions continued to arrive from distant shores. Italians, Poles, Jews, Russians, Chinese. They came carrying the weight of old worlds and the hope of new beginnings. Ellis Island echoed with their names, their languages, their fears. Many settled in crowded tenements, working 10, 12, 14 hours a day in factories that never rested. They built bridges, stitched clothes, cleaned streets and raised the buildings that defined modern America. Their reward was survival, but also belonging. It was a time of extremes, astonishing progress, unbearable inequality. In the marble halls of Manhattan, the wealthy held glittering balls under chandeliers of 1,000 lights. In the shadows of those same buildings, families slept 10 to a room. The newspapers called it the Gilded Age, golden on the surface but fragile beneath. Children worked beside adults, faces grey with soot. Women labored without rights, without rest. Accidents were common and justice was rare, but voices were rising, reformers, writers, journalists. The muckrakers they were called, digging through corruption to reveal the truth. Upton Sinclair wrote of slaughterhouses and sweatshops. Ida Tarbell exposed the power of monopolies. Each word became a spark in the growing fire of reform. Across the country, new movements began to take shape. Farmers demanded fair prices, workers demanded unions, women demanded the vote. Their marches filled the streets, their banners fluttered in the wind. Equality, justice, bread and roses. It was the beginning of a new awakening, a moral revolution that sought to match progress with conscience. In the White House, President Theodore Roosevelt became the symbol of this restless age. He fought monopolies, preserved forests, built national parks, and dreamed of a Panama Canal that would unite the oceans. He called it the Square Deal, fairness for worker and owner alike, though fairness was always a moving target. Still, he believed that a great nation should protect its weakest, not devour them. The 1900s roared forward like a locomotive. Airplanes lifted off the ground for the first time, fragile wings against the wind. Motion pictures flickered across silver screens, turning dreams into light. The human voice traveled through wires. Time itself seemed to accelerate. Yet, beneath the optimism, the old world's troubles were stirring again. Across Europe, rival empires armed themselves for a conflict few truly understood. By 1914, the first shots of the Great War echoed across the Atlantic. In muddy trenches from Belgium to France, millions of men vanished into smoke and silence. At first, America watched from afar, isolated, hesitant. President Woodrow Wilson promised neutrality, and the nation focused inward, building, inventing, working. But the oceans were no longer walls. When ships were sunk and allies called for aid, the United States entered the war in 1917. Not as an empire, but as a promise, a defender of democracy in a world gone mad. The country transformed overnight. Factories turned from cars to cannons, from typewriters to rifles. Posters filled every street corner. Uncle Sam wants you. Men enlisted by the millions. Women took their places in the factories they left behind. Fields became training grounds. Cities became supply lines. It was a war fought with machines, tanks, gas, airplanes, telegraphs, all born of modern invention, now used to destroy. Across the Atlantic, the young soldiers of America marched through villages no one at home could pronounce. They wrote letters by candlelight, dreaming of home, believing that this war somehow would end all wars. When the fighting finally ceased in November 1918, the silence that followed was immense. The world stood still, a graveyard stretching from one horizon to the next. Millions were gone. An entire generation had vanished into history's smoke. The Americans came home to parades, but also to confusion. They had fought to make the world safe for democracy, yet returned to a nation still divided by race, class, and fear. The promise of peace felt fragile, as if built on the edge of thunder. And yet, the age had changed everything. The old world had ended. The new world, industrial, connected, unstoppable, had begun. America stood on the threshold of global power, its people filled with pride and exhaustion. Factories were silent for a moment, then began again. Cities glowed brighter, airplanes dotted the sky, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as if humanity had triumphed over its own chaos. The guns of the Great War had fallen silent, and the world tried to dream again. The 1920s began not with mourning, but with music. Jazz poured from every city street, trumpets, laughter, and motion. The world was changing once more, and America danced into the future. Factories reopened, cities grew brighter, faster, louder. Electric signs lit up New York and Chicago like constellations made by human hands. Cars filled the roads, radios filled the air, and for the first time, millions shared the same songs, the same news, the same dreams. The Roaring Twenties, they called it, an age of speed and sparkle, of flappers and freedom, of skyscrapers that touched the clouds. Women had won the right to vote. Movies spoke, airplanes soared, and fortunes rose as quickly as they fell. In Wall Street offices, paper fortunes multiplied in a haze of confidence. Everyone believed the good times would never end, but good times are fragile things. In October 1929, the illusion shattered. The stock market crashed like a wave of glass, and the glittering age went dark. Banks collapsed, factories closed, millions lost their homes, their savings, their hope. The Great Depression had begun. Across the nation, families wandered dusty roads with everything they owned piled into trucks and wagons. In the Great Plains, the soil itself turned against them, a storm of dust that swallowed farms, homes, and lives. They called it the Dust Bowl. People covered their faces, their windows, their children. The land, once rich and golden, had become a sea of wind and ruin. In the cities, bread lines stretched around corners. Men who had built railroads now waited for a bowl of soup. Children learned hunger before they learned reading. And yet, even in that darkness, the spirit of endurance remained. In 1933, a new voice spoke to the nation. Calm, confident, steady. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the oath of office and promised a New Deal. In his first speech, he told a weary people, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." His words were like light through fog. The government began to rebuild from the ground. Dams rose across rivers, bridges spanned valleys, workers carved tunnels and planted forests. The unemployed became builders of a new nation. Artists painted murals, writers recorded history, musicians filled the air with songs of endurance. It was not wealth they found, but purpose. Slowly, the economy began to breathe again. Hope returned, fragile, cautious, but real. And then, just as the nation began to stand again, the world began to fall apart. In Europe, old ghosts stirred once more. Dictators rose from the wreckage of the Great War, men who promised strength and order at any cost. Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy. Their words spread faster than truth. Their armies followed soon after. By 1939, the world was at war again. This time, the storm would reach every shore. At first, America stayed back, still haunted by the memory of trenches and graves. Isolation seemed safe, but safety is never permanent. When Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the illusion ended in fire and smoke. America woke as a giant DOS, slowly but with immense force. Factories roared to life once more, this time for war. Men enlisted by the millions, and women stepped into the jobs they left behind. They became welders, engineers, nurses, codebreakers, pilots. Rosie the Riveter, with her rolled-up sleeves and determined eyes, became the face of a generation. From the deserts of Africa to the beaches of France, from the islands of the Pacific to the skies above Germany, Americans fought beside allies against tyranny. The war united the nation in purpose, but divided it in cost. Ration books replaced abundance. Families waited for letters that sometimes never came. Victory seemed both near and unreachable. In 1914, the Allied armies stormed the beaches of Normandy. The sea was red, the sky grey, but the world held its breath, and the tide of war began to turn. By 1945, the dictators who had promised eternity lay defeated. Cities burned, millions were dead, and the planet was scarred by its own invention. That summer, a new weapon was tested, a flash brighter than the sun. The atomic bomb ended the war, but began a new age, one of awe and dread. Humanity had won its greatest battle and built its greatest danger. When the soldiers came home, they found a world forever changed. The cities were the same, but their hearts were not. There were no parades for the dead, no speeches that could fill the empty chairs, and yet, through all the loss, a quiet strength endured. America stood again, powerful, wary, wiser. It had survived depression and war. It had fed the world, armed allies, and proven that freedom could fight back against darkness. But victory raised new questions. What comes after power? What does peace mean, when peace itself carries the memory of fire? The world looked to America for leadership, and America looked inward for meaning. The future would be built not just by soldiers or presidents, but by families, dreamers, workers, by those who had learned to rebuild from nothing. And so, the lights of a new age flickered on, the world exhaled, calm for the first time in years, but in the distance a new tension was already rising. The war was over, but peace came wearing a different face. The world was no longer divided by armies, it was divided by ideas. In the ruins of Europe and Asia, two powers now stood unchallenged, the United States and the Soviet Union. Between them stretched not a battlefield, but a silence filled with satellites, secrets, and fear. They called it the Cold War, and for more than 40 years, it would shape the world's breath. At home, America entered an age of plenty. The economy boomed. Factories that had once built tanks now made cars, radios, refrigerators. Suburbs spread across the land like new constellations. Rows of houses with white fences and green lawns. Highways stretched toward the horizon, carrying families toward the promise of stability. It was a time of television, of Elvis and diners and baseball under the summer sky. To many, it felt like the dream had finally come true. Yet dreams are never simple. Beneath the calm surface ran the currents of anxiety. Duck and cover drills in classrooms, air raid sirens echoing in the night, the quiet dread of nuclear fire. The atomic bomb had ended one war but begun a new kind of fear, the fear that peace itself might vanish in a flash of light. In 1957, the world looked upward and gasped. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite to circle the Earth. A beeping metal sphere, smaller than a beach ball, and yet it changed everything. The race for the skies had begun. America answered with rockets, laboratories, and classrooms full of young dreamers staring at the stars. The space race became a new frontier, not of conquest, but of wonder. And in 1969, on a quiet night watched by millions, a human voice spoke from another world. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The moon landing was more than victory, it was poetry, a symbol of what humanity could achieve when it reached upward instead of inward. But not all battles were fought in space. At home, another revolution was taking shape, not of weapons, but of words, courage, and conscience. In the South, black Americans who had waited a century for true freedom began to march. They faced fire hoses, jail cells, and hatred, armed only with faith and the belief that equality was not a dream, but a right. Rosa Parks sat down on a bus and refused to stand. Martin Luther King Jr. stood up on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and spoke words that echoed across generations. I have a dream. The civil rights movement became the moral heartbeat of the nation. Laws changed, but hearts took longer. Still, step by step, the country began to move forward. Imperfectly, painfully, but undeniably. The 1960s burned with energy and contradiction. Peace marches filled the streets. Music spoke louder than speeches. Young people questioned everything: war, government, tradition, even the nature of love and freedom. In distant jungles, another conflict raged. Vietnam. It was a war that divided not continents but generations. Televisions brought its images into every home. Flames, helicopters, soldiers trudging through mud. For the first time, war was not distant, it was visible. And many asked, why are we fighting at all? By the 1970s, that question had fractured the country. Trust in leaders faltered. The Watergate scandal shook faith in government itself. But history, as always, kept moving. Slower, quieter, but never still. As the Cold War deepened, the arms race grew colder still. Nuclear missiles lined silos like silent prayers against annihilation. Yet amid the fear, humanity kept building, inventing, dreaming. Computers filled entire rooms, blinking, humming, calculating. Scientists imagined a future where machines could speak, think, and connect. The digital age was stirring, though few yet recognized its heartbeat. In the 1980s, a new confidence swept through America. Bright colors, loud music, and neon lights painted over a decade of doubt. The economy revived. The personal computer arrived. Satellites circled the globe, bringing voices and pictures from everywhere to everyone. President Ronald Reagan spoke of a shining city on a hill, of optimism, strength, and freedom triumphant. And while the rhetoric soared, the tension with the Soviet Union finally began to soften. The wall that had divided Berlin for a generation began to crack. And in 1989, as people climbed atop it and swung hammers against the stone, the Cold War came to an end not with an explosion, but with a cheer. The century that had begun with horses and telegrams ended with rockets, satellites, and computers. The divided world had survived itself. The dream had not vanished. It had simply changed shape. But the story of America remained the same. A story of contrasts, of light and shadow, of hope that refused to die, even in the face of fear. The 20th century closed not with a battle, but with a breath. The Cold War was over. The wall had fallen. The world, for a moment, seemed weightless. In the glow of television screens, crowds celebrated the end of fear. For the first time in living memory, there was no great enemy, no global war, only possibility. The map of the world, once carved by empires, now blurred into networks and markets. And at the center of it all stood a nation both young and ancient, the United States of America. The 1990s were an age of optimism, a moment when progress felt inevitable. Computers, once the size of rooms, now fit on desks. The internet was born, carrying information through invisible threads that wrapped around the globe. Emails replaced letters, voices traveled through cables, and the distance between people seemed to vanish overnight. In Silicon Valley, a new kind of frontier opened, not of land, but of code. Dreamers with ideas instead of armies began to reshape the world. Companies with names like Apple, Microsoft, and Google grew faster than nations. Information became the new gold, and imagination the new power. Music, movies, and culture spread faster than ever before. A song written in one room could reach 1 billion ears. The century of industry had given way to the century of connection. But even in connection, division remained. In 2001, a clear September morning turned to smoke and sorrow. The Twin Towers of New York City were attacked. The skyline fell, and with it, the illusion of invulnerability. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost, and the world stood still once more. The attack on September 11th marked the dawn of a new era, the age of uncertainty. In its wake came war, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Long and costly, fought in deserts far from home. Airports filled with checkpoints, and fear returned to the public heart. Yet from the ashes of tragedy came a fragile unity. Flags appeared on porches, candles in windows. For a brief moment, America remembered how to stand together, not as states or parties, but as people. The years that followed brought new triumphs and new trials. Technology reshaped everything. Social media connected billions and divided them. Voices once silent could now speak to the world. But with those voices came noise, confusion, and conflict. Politics grew louder. Truth became harder to hold. Screens filled every hand, every room, every hour. We could talk to anyone, anywhere, yet sometimes it felt as if we had forgotten how to listen. The digital age gave humanity more power than ever before, and forced it to confront what it truly valued. Through recessions, storms, and pandemics, the rhythm of life changed again. In 2008, the world watched as financial systems faltered, and the idea of endless growth proved once more an illusion. But new generations kept rising, hopeful, creative, restless. Movements for equality, climate, and justice filled the streets and screens. Science reached deeper into space, decoding genomes and distant galaxies. Voices demanded to be heard, every kind, every color, every belief. The United States, as always, reflected the world's contradictions: wealth and poverty, unity and division, pride and pain. But through it all, its story remained one of persistence, a nation forever trying to bridge the gap between its promise and its practice. In the early 21st century, humanity faced a new kind of frontier, not the West, not the moon, but the invisible world of data and discovery. the frontier of the mind, artificial intelligence, renewable energy, medicine, and machines that could learn. Each invention another reflection of our own desire to understand and to endure. And through it all, the dream persisted, not just the American dream, but the human one, that life could be better, kinder, freer. As the century turns once more, the United States stands both humbled and hopeful, a mosaic of millions, still arguing, still reaching, still believing that tomorrow can be brighter than today. The farms, the cities, the deserts, and the coasts, each tells part of the same story, of people who build, break, and rebuild again. The world that began in wilderness and wood now hums with fiber and light. But listen closely, and beneath the noise, the same heartbeat remains. The sound of a people still searching for balance between power and peace, freedom and responsibility, ambition and grace.